Let's do it. All right. If I don't know you, my name is Nathan Wallace. I am here in Orlando with the City Lab program. Let me get into my MRP. Let me explain what user-operated and of a human design might look like. My design intent is to capture the influence of an occupant on architecture, objects, to define better solutions based on human-centered design. This really gets at the experience of a person and personalizing that experience. What I mean by personalizing the occupant is that designers need to analyze, they have to analyze rituals, actions, haptics in architecture, and devices. And then the designers led to the occupant's response. The response to these interactions between humans and the built environment helped to develop our understanding of how to design for the human body and mind. Observing operations comes first. This is identifying and displaying the actions of the occupant. This is where a distinction is made. Occupants become users because they now operate with and within architecture. Operations of the user explain trends and the intuitive nature of rituals and actions while involved with haptics, devices, and specifics of the built environment. The personal moments between a user and architecture allows a designer an opportunity to apply their intentions with what the user will interact with. So where does the idea behind the user come from? Architecture is firstly and most simply created for people and users. Vitruvius in De Architectura begins to define architecture with town planning, materials, orders, and aesthetic principles. Despite architecture's broad range of description, it must function for the user. Louis Sullivan later coins the phrase form ever follows function from his understanding of architecture and Vitruvius' 10 books. This maxim, along with the modernist movement, helped to bring machine living in the 1930s. From there, a focus of architecture is mechanized as though it is become a product for using. Many architects today, like Ol Sheeran, presents the same modernity movement with the current contemporary push for interactional spaces. He alters this maxim to form follows fiction. Fiction represents the narratives of people that move through spaces, and this personalizes the user. Both his projects, CCTV and the Collaborative Cloud, are examples of how the conversation of functionality has gradually turned into a conversation about personal stories. The interactions of users with architecture is directly reflective of their physical and mental relationship in the world. Phenomenology can be explained by Dasein, a German word meaning being there, presence. Dasein is explored as a main mode of seeing the world in objects. Some of the earliest studies of phenomenology is by Martin Heidegger. In his book, in his 1927 book called Being in Time, Heidegger explains how people experience the world spatially relative to their own body. He says that the interactions of a person's Dasein is found in its space of the surrounding world because Dasein itself is spatial in regard to its being in the world. Robert Morris's phenomenological approach explains that in replacing the static noun form with the verb act, there is a shift to dialectical formulation. This formulation is contrary to functionalism. Here, the act of design develops an experience. As a person creates an experience is revealed, where functionalism can be very linear in its process of creation. Johanni Palasma explains how architecture is an experience of the skin. He explains that all other senses are modes of touching related to tactility. The relationship between architecture and the body is touch, where all other senses are based within. Plasma furthers that skin creates the gateway to this world and our body receives reference to. He describes that this is the body that is truly the navel of his world, not in the sense of the viewing point of central perspective, but as a very focus of reference, memory, imagination, and integration. The literal relationship between our bodies and the world creates the study of behavior. Lars Lerup explains how functionalism studied in an extreme can be referred to as superfunctionalism or behavioralism, because it studies how people will behave in order to design more functionally. It perhaps could be taken further with interactionalism, but Lerup makes the point that behavior and interaction is not easily documented or understood as concrete points to set diagram per se. There are certain controls with behavior. Behavior is an unpredictable and extremely variable thing, and Twyla Tharp helps to define what human rituals are in her work of choreography. She points out how there's dependability in ritual, and that defining rituals within a controlled moment can lead to an understanding or an interaction or interactions. These understandings of rituals can inherently begin to define different types of vernaculars. The study of ritualistic moments can be applied to the act of creating as well. Stuart Brand explains how dwelling in architecture is separate from the designers, that people intend to use architecture the way they want without the designer's permission, if you will. So let me describe how the design for the user, beginning with Don Norman's studies on human-centered design. Norman identifies human responses and understandings of design and gives many examples of this. Humans respond to what they receive from architecture. In this example, as Norman is commonly known for, a bad door design puts the designer at fault, not the user. Good design is usually unnoticed by the user. So what is in the mind of the user? There are three what are called levels of cognition that refer to knowledge in the world. At the visceral level, muscle responses shape behavior, perhaps like being frightened or experiencing an immediate reaction. The behavioral level is learned, much like the operation of driving a car, although your body is performing many actions at one time. The conscious mind is focused on what's outside of the car. And the reflective level is where you consciously think through experiences or evaluate what can happen or what has happened. All these levels obviously include recognizing the built environment, but more importantly, they include how the user thinks when interacting with objects. What to notice here is a majority of the actions are carried out in the subconscious thought. It is only in reflective that there is a conscious thought. So how can the designer understand what the user responds to? Simply, it's observation. Every design for a user has a list of criteria that the designer has or has not thought about. These are the principles of design. In the case of users, there's certain precedents that provides examples of observation. At a large scale, William White studies social interactions in urban environments. In the case of plazas, how people use architecture, how they interact with each other in context. But beginning to think about a more personal scale, I have to rethink the studies of a precedent. Precedents in this case are less recognizable. Perhaps I have to create my own case study to develop these observations. So precedent theorists all point towards the operations of the user instead of the plastics of the environment. So let me show you my project as I transition to Miro. Let's talk about these operations. The problem is that the designer's perspective can be more effectively evaluated. This is through a methodology to provide designers with solutions. My objective is to apply this method to better influence design rationale in regards to the user experience and operations. So what is this method? Like I began, it starts with observation. This is identifying the actions of the user. And then this is based in those design principles. You can use them as criteria: discoverability, feedback, affordances, signifiers, and then mappings, conceptual models, and constraints are kind of embedded within those. So from your recordings of observations, you can then analyze, and this is translating those observations. It's identifying what makes them unique through the criteria, and this is diagramming. We've coined the phrase in my committee, diagrammation. In this process, you'll see that in a moment. From there, we get into mapping, which is a reverse operation. It's almost reverse engineering the whole operation. And this is a little different than prototyping, but similar. So you can kind of relate it to product design. And then we can draw conclusions based on all these principles and comparing the observations analysis from the mapping. So, observations. The application in this project stands as a pilot study. And in this pilot, I focus on the doorknob as an architectural device. You can see some of these observations here. And I recorded 9 subjects doing the same operation to the same device. In 2 perspectives, one in slow motion, and you can begin to hear some of the mechanics of the door latch. You can see the vibrations of the door and the device as each user operates it. And this type of observation is related to the concept known as thin slicing. This is a type of photographic study as motion picture projection is pulled apart. This is related to the pioneer Edward Muybridge's work in producing motion in the subjects through photography in the late 1800s. From observation, next comes analysis. This is one example of the first subject. This is like I said, a diagrammation. In order to understand the structure, spatial components, and orientation of the hand. With analysis, the designer can begin to see correlations between other objects. Using the principles, the design principles, in this case, discoverability, the anticipatory movements of the subjects are plotted. If you're still hearing noises, that's the slow motion video. Gathering the subjects into spatial collections like positioning and enclosure begins to reveal the subconscious differences between each operation and user. An enclosure of the hand proves a foreshadowing to the device, almost as though the hand is inscribing the device itself. There's other correlations and groupings. You can see in one subject, there's a reach with the fingers, a little more unusual than typical users in this pilot study. You can see the imprinting on the fingers with that foreshadowing. There, 3 subjects use kind of leading with the proximal palm or the top of the palm, where the base of the fingers meet the palm, and this was fairly common along with the outer palm or base thumb focus, where there's kind of a pinching on either side of the base of the palm. And that's kind of how the operation begins to commence before even a tactility with the device. And this one was most common where the user is leading with the thumb, much like crosshairs. You see the device and your thumb leads towards it as you begin to approach the anticipating operation. From analysis, the method reverses the operation to create mapping. This is that third moment in the method. By creating replica clay models, the user performs the same operation. The clay becomes a body that creates artifacts of the hand. This creates a cartography over each model as they're replicated from the device, and you can see each impression of the user on each clay model after they've been dried. Section mapping of the device body creates a cartography, just as I said, like an X-ray dissects a living body. These are 3D scanned to pull sections from. And each one has a specific imprint of the user. These sections are pulled at through the center of the device. You can see these cuts here. And this is this overlay is similar to a reflected ceiling plan. It's looking from the bottom up. From here, the designer's conclusion is a differential between the analysis of operations and the artifacts that the operations leave behind. The motions of the user operations prove to show the design criteria of the device. The device in this pilot shows an effort of the user in torque. The operation is less about the door and more about the latch and operation mechanism. You can see the difference between the analysis and the mapping or artifact. And you can see how the motion of the device extends between each artifact. And you can see, even though this is a thin slicing mapping to produce this artifact, you can see together with the analysis and the artifact that the designer can then deduce what a conclusion might be. And this is all through this method. Thank you.
I will open up first to the critics, guest critics. Questions or comments?
Well, the beginning I was really impressed with. I didn't have enough time to take enough notes. There were things I wanted to look up in more detail because it was so interesting. I was wondering, when you were talking about human-centered design, why did you use a doorknob, which is sort of passé anyway? It's not you were just using an example, because a doorknob is not considered something that's actually a very viable latch for a door now, because it's not accessible. Is there a particular reason why you chose to use an object that's sort of past its time?
It's a good question. I did contemplate other devices or architectural objects like a stair step, the threshold of a door itself, perhaps a window or a portion of a window. A lot of these things, I found interest in all of them, but I needed to focus on one. And a doorknob is very, the use or operation is very intuitive from a subject's perspective. Like a window, the operation of a window is very particular and very broad. The use of a doorknob is very specific. But the idea here is that this method could be used on any object or architectural device, or even spatial qualities of like a room.
First, I want to start that tell you that it was very, very interesting and thorough research, very well presented. Very interesting to me to listen to it. Some of the precedents, of course, I'm familiar with, and some of them were new. And also the combination, the way you are able to take all those resources and reorganize them through history, like through time, and center on your own point of view is in a very original way is a great achievement. So it's a very interesting high level research. So I really first tell you, enjoy to listen to your presentation. And now, feedback. So I wrote some notes here for myself. So your research is about human-centered design. You didn't mention the word ergonomic, although you did show ergonomic diagrams, and maybe it could become a category also, because ergonomy is the science of connecting between the human body to furniture and space around it, or vessels to hold it. And it is a science. There are a lot of books, a lot of literature. And for example, like the chair, if we take a chair at the beginning, a chair was a decorative object in the 18th, 19th century. And then it became, when we started to have this sitting lifestyle, because we sit all the time, it evolved through history, and it's actually something that now reshaping our muscles, our body, my relationship to the chair, not only mine, and the computer, and what I do in the chair all day, that's my main thing, that work instrument is shaping my muscles, my weight, my posture, and so on and so forth. So I think it could be an interesting link there. Another thing that I'm not sure if I missed or you mentioned is the topic of proportions. Like you started with the models of the human body, and I think you skipped it. There are architects, from Renaissance time to modernism who connected the human body diagram into a set of proportion of the whole building. And I think I didn't see it. I mean, I saw those diagrams, but you didn't highlight it. And maybe this will be the point where you take now the doorknob and make a building out of it. Because you're saying it's a human-centered design, it's a method. And you did the first analysis kind of part. You did the studying part. And I assume that the second half of the semester, you want to apply it somehow or to use it in order to generate a new design. And maybe this will, a possible link is to take the human body, the Corbusier or the Renaissance one, the relationship, because in your analysis, you show the hand and the set of the dimensions between the hand and the whole body and the whole building is already something that many people explored. So it could be a point of departure. for you. Another thing that I wrote here, well, I love the tactility and the visual tactility. Another person that I don't think you mentioned it, talking about haptic. Tactility is Deleuze in The Smooth and Striated in 1,000 years of nonlinear history. It's one article, and this article has so many things that are very contemporary architects are dealing with, and he's talking about tactile vision. It's the way, and it is, to me, always linked very well with what we do in the virtual realm and the digital realm, because when we work with texture and mapping, you know, depth map and all of this, we create visual tactility. We play between materiality and immateriality of the digital realm, and you know, so this will be another reference. And I also want to talk about. You show the doorknob analysis is very beautiful and also original and well done and very systematic. You made it like a science of it, but also very beautiful and aesthetic, you know, set of drawings, which is, you know, it's a great achievement, and the analysis process develops your skill as a designer, you know, your graphics, your proportion, the line thickness, the contrast, and all of this is already like methods that you develop your sensitivity, you develop your design language. But I want to talk about two things that may be missing. Somewhere there, I would want to see dimensions. Of the doorknob that I didn't see. And another thing that links to the dimension is universal design versus specificity of the design. And this is something that, you know, when I was working, we did a workshop many years ago about, how's it called? Performance-based design. It's also something that you didn't mention. It is it's like 10 years old or 15 years old method of design, performance-based design. Do you know what it is?
It sounds familiar.
There are books. I don't know where it started, but definitely there was a center at the AA in London. They have some books about performalism, performance-based design by, I think, Achim Magnus, and yeah, the names will come. Also, the one who's Dean of Newark now, what's his name? Do you remember, John? I will, there are several books on performance-based design. So performance-based design is a method, it's a digital design method where you define criteria and then you use algorithms and parametric design, and you create a lot of variations. Like the computer can generate, millions of variations, and then you evaluate them according to the criteria that you set. For example, amount of sun on a surface in a certain day or season or something like that. So it's a design method, and it could be applied. It's something similar to what you're trying to do. And the criticism on performance-based design, like if I want to make a building that gets at least this amount of sun radiation and so on and so forth, is that it becomes too specific. What happens in 2 years after I completed my very specific project, somebody come and take down a building or add another floor, and it casts shadow on my building? What happens if the program in the building changes? It's not anymore an apartment, but it becomes an apartment. So it brings out this problem or question. My design should be so highly specified like you did, highly customized, mass customized, you know, like the handle you did for that is custom, almost custom made to the person. But what happened if I come to visit you and I use this door to the bathroom? Could I use it? You know, what happened if this occupant have to move out? So it brings up this question: how much should it be universal? And universal has disadvantages that it's very inclusive, right? It takes, like, if my grandmother has problems like arthritis, she can't operate it. And if it's a child, and if it's a woman and a man, you know, all those sizes and differences, should it work for all of them? Or should it be mass customized to each person has an own handle? Like I have in my pocket or on my key, my handle, and I like plug it into every door because this is my own handle, kind of extremes.
Yeah.
And I think when your analysis, like the method you develop, will become a generative process to design a human-centered design, to create a human-centered design, you will have to answer it or find your position. Is it universal or is it mass customized? And it brings up a huge, you know, mass customization. Of course, it's used with all the digital fabrication, and you know, it brings it. If you address this, then you bring into your thesis your some very contemporary design methods, and you address them, and so it makes your thesis and method so much more based on what's going on right now.
Thank you. You hit on a lot of points. One was ergonomics, one was portions, and you talk about different methodologies. To go back to ergonomics, I did think about, you know, there's furniture and product design, and I didn't go into that category. Like you mentioned, it could be a separate category, and it is. The only reason why I strayed from it is because, like you mentioned, it's less universal and more specific. And I was looking at specific architectural devices, things that are typically embedded, you know, something like a light switch, or objects on a door or windows or stairs, railings, guardrails, you name it, that is more universal. So I think that's why I didn't go down the ergonomics path. But you make a great point, especially on proportions, and this different scales to this method. I do, in this case, in this pilot study, I focus on one scale, and it's kind of like at this hand scale. But I believe that it can be used at different scales, even just as you mentioned, having the dimension and the scale relatable to other things. Things like within discoverability, which is one of the criteria here, enclosure kind of implies at other scales. So a room is enclosure, a threshold is enclosure, and at the same time, a hand creates an enclosure. But there's differences there. So I think that's a great point that you made. So thank you. I have a lot of notes that I can add to my writing. So thank you.
Nathan, are you familiar with the work of Naoto Fukusawa? He's a Japanese product designer.
I've heard the name. I believe so. Yes.
Look into his work. One of the things he was charged with a long time ago was redesigning a cell phone, and how we've all become really accustomed to smoothness, right? And a lot of product design has moved towards as seamless a product as possible, such as what Jonathan Ives has done or did with Mac, with
Was
Apple.
he in Objectivity, that documentary?
He was one of the designers in the
Okay, yes.
and Objectified. But
Objectified.
what he noticed was the facets and the irregularities in a surface sort of beckon our hand to constantly be going over and feeling the edges and so on and so forth. Your clay studies reminded me of his design for a cell phone, which was less perfect and was covered in these edges that would be more interesting to touch, something that didn't fit the hand so perfectly. And because of that, we kind of acknowledge it as an object, as a thing, to use the Heideggerian sense of a thing. So I wonder still, where would this go? We've got one of the most beautiful presentations that I've seen in an MRP in terms of your production, the way that you laid out your ideas and your thesis. Really well done. And the drawings and the studies themselves are quite beautiful. And you have the conclusion board. But in design, I would always think the conclusions are that design step, that act of doing, that act of creating. So what would come from this? I mean, I know that your MRP comes to an end here very soon,
Right.
but I'm still not hearing where this as the analogy or the stand-in for applying your process to any design proposition. What happens with the doorknob? What is that next step?
Right. So I hear you, and that's a good question. I've been thinking about this kind of nonstop for the past couple of weeks, because how do I apply? I mean, I obviously have applied this method, but how do I apply a conclusion to design? And the conclusion, one of the conclusions I made in this pilot was that it shows the effort in torque, and it's more about latch and lock mechanisms. So I can deduce that there are other types of doorknobs that provide a better user experience in that certain situation when you are just thinking about the latch and mechanism. My mom this past week reminded me that, and we have similar doorknobs at my parents' house. They're different, but they're still your typical doorknob. And she said that if we had lever doorknobs, that our childhood dog and cat would have been able to open them because of how easy they are to operate. You just push down and pull. But in this case, so much of the effort is put into twisting the device, and very little of it is pulling open the door. So I think I could, now this gets into like product design, of developing a different product or something like that based off of these conclusions. And that's an ocean that I'd have to dive into. Or like it was mentioned, the difference in proportions and scales can be applied to spatial places, or certain elements within architecture, like a atrium or a hallway, and certain things can be analyzed, first observed, analyzed, and then a user mapping can be created from that and deduce similar things so that it can be The whole goal here is for the designer that is using this method can create a better, more rigorous design without kind of stealing precedence, I'll say, or I'll call it that, because in the design profession that I'm familiar with in my everyday life, it's commonplace to see a precedent that is similar to what your mind's eye might envision for the design. And because it's a good precedent, you simply use what was done. But in this case, instead of using the precedent, you're using a method to understand why it is successful from the user's point of view. Does that make sense?
Nathan, I'm going to jump in with a couple quick comments before we run out of time.
Yeah.
Well, I too agree with everyone's comments that the presentation was really well thought out and, you know, really nice graphics and put together very thoughtfully. So I applaud you there. I too have some of the same questions that Professor Mays and Professor Grant brought up, in that I think your selection of the doorknob was a bit odd, in that this doorknob in particular wasn't very ergonomic to begin with. And, you know, is out of date and not accessible. So I think maybe if you could go back in time and I could recommend a different doorknob, it would have been one that was integrated into something that wasn't mechanical, like that it was a place that my hand kind of fit within or somehow could grab onto and pull, but wasn't something that I needed to turn or use some sort of mechanism. Because then by eliminating the mechanism, you're reducing the number of variables that are at play, and you're really getting into the ergonomic part of the study. The other thing I notice is that you know, really with your thesis, you've created a process for analysis, a way to look at, say, the artifact, as Stephen Grant's pointing out, the artifact that is the doorknob, and to analyze it, which you've done in producing these 9 doorknobs, or 9 kind of artifacts in response. But what you haven't done is help us understand how we move forward. And that's where Professor Mays' questions come in, is like, okay, so great, we've got this analysis of the way these 9 people use the doorknob, but we don't have anywhere to go with it. Like, you haven't told us how as a designer do I apply this in my future work? You know, I think you need potentially in your book to have some sort of conclusion, like these are the 9 analyses that I've produced, and then this is the doorknob that I recommend moving forward with. Like, how do you bring these 9 artifacts together to produce something that I can then use? And that points to you need greater significance or impact, like a way to apply this for me or for others that might read your thesis.
You almost need to create a universal doorknob, an accessible doorknob. That's where you could go with it, instead of a latch, an actual universal doorknob. That would be interesting.
Cool.
You know, we did challenge him on the doorknob extensively. I just wrote a little note because I remember, Nathan, you having a reason that day that made me say, oh, of course. And I can't remember what it was. Perhaps you can remember what it was, but it did have something to do with analyzing something that was really, you know, a failure, that did not have it didn't have universal design characteristics, and that's the main one actually that has caused us to switch to the lever. But the lever catches my clothes. The lever can be opened by pets. There are so many reasons that the lever fails. That, you know, Professor Grant is suggesting that there may be a better doorknob. Professor Gamble is suggesting that if there isn't a better doorknob, what's the point? So I think it is great because you've done all this work, and I don't think there's anything you have to redo other than perhaps, I think, add dimensions, which is something we did talk about. Did you put the degrees in there? We talked about yes, you have some of the degrees there. So there is kind of that precision that Professor Ron recommended, which you can add to this. That actually may feed into what it is that comes out of this. And, you know, to go another route, there is Muratovsky and others critique some of the design that happens for design's sake. What's his name? Philippe Stark's stuff. He actually, that's where he centers his critique as being not research-based design. But what you're telling us is that we should be engaged in research-based design, and that it can tell us something, and that as Professor Mays talked about with, you know, how we handle our cell phones, that there's something to it. There also, as far as doorknobs go, is a certain amount of fashion that goes with it, or engagement with humans' taste, or emotional feeling about a thing. And there may be a doorknob that is personal enough, but not that isn't that can still be used by other people. So not to the extreme that Professor Ron is talking about, but also not to the banality Professor Grant or Gamble were talking about with this failed object.
Yeah, I follow that. And I think you're referring to a conversation we had, and I was talking about how, you know, in any given office like mine at work, and we're, you know, looking at like a staircase, and there are different professionals looking at it. I suppose you could call me one of them. And there's different conclusions to a problem from each designer's point of view. Obviously, the architect has an experience that is much greater than mine in their conclusion, and perhaps they've seen something, like if we're staring at a staircase, and you know, something so specific at how the guardrail is in relation to a hallway, as if the staircase was floating next to the hallway, what is comfortable from the user's point of view to be next to this guardrail in this hallway. And I'm going to deduce a conclusion, and of course I think it's right. The architect and other designers will deduce a conclusion, but which one is good? And you can relate the same analogy or situation to huge topics in design, like what makes good design, question mark. Like, is it because some big architect like Big did it? Is it because of the whole idea behind the precedent, because somebody qualified created it, therefore it makes it good? I am implying in this case that that's not true. That you have to deduce a reasoning through this method to understand what is good design from the user's perspective.
Yeah, I like that actually, because, you know, you start out with that statement from Don Norman, says good design goes basically unnoticed, but I don't think architects feel that way. And I don't think that we want it that way. We really want to engage people beyond kind of normal habit. And that's in fact kind of what we're constantly engaged in. So I think that's really a good statement coming out of this. Any last remarks? Edward has something he may want to share. If not,
I'm like direct messaging Nathan.
okay,
Yeah.
good. Go ahead and
Yeah,
share
I
it with
just
him.
saw it.
He was showing. Was it the Peter Zumthor door handle or My Young Song?
It was just a student's work from
Yeah.
K2 class last fall that addresses door handles, that making technique of making.
Yes.
So the series of door handle designs, I thought it was my interest in that.
Yeah, thank you.
I can share. I can put a link to everyone.
For
Yeah.
anyone with a presentation that references Twyla Tharp, I think you're already ahead of the game.
Thanks.
Yeah, Nathan, I never get bored of that presentation, and it's only gotten better.
Thank you.
That.
Thank you. I appreciate everyone's time. Thank you so much for your comments.
When you have a presentation that the listeners want more, it's pretty good.
Well, that's
usually
good.
Usually I want less.
Yeah, I have a lot more to say about this topic, so I
want to definitely read your final product.
Yeah, I'm excited, and I'll share it with all of you, given the chance. So thank you so much.
Professor Ron, Ruth, thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you.
Fantastic input.
Yeah, I have the name of my son on the Zoom. He used the computer for me. It's like working from home, sharing computers, and then
That's
sometimes
right.
I appear as different personas.
And Nathan, I'll give you a little buyout on Ruth Ron. We don't have, I guess, too much time left today because we have to be out of here. But
he can email me.
Yeah.
If he has questions.
Yeah.
It is great to
Thank
see
you.
you, Ruth.
Bye. You too.
Thank
Bye.
you so much.
Thanks.
Ciao.
Thank you all.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, very much. Thank you.